Well, good evening, everyone. There's nothing like being put on the spot, I suppose. I thought I'd begin by establishing the level of expertise in the audience. How many of you have children? Right? How many of you have been a child? Right. So we're going to assume that the level of expertise for any talk about education is fairly high in this audience. What I want to talk about is the current challenge facing Scottish school education. Now, part of the difficulty with this challenge is defining exactly what it is. It used to be the case that we thought that was the issue. We now realise that this is the issue. What we do about it, of course, is quite a different thing. But if there's one thing that Scottish education needs, it's some way of dealing with the gap between the least and the most advantaged in our society. Now, I've been in education for over 40 years, and that gap hasn't closed. So there's something incredibly important facing our society. There's hardly a day goes by where it's not at some level or another on the Scottish news. But I do think part of the difficulty we have is framing the question, what is it that we're trying to do? And when we come to that, we have to decide, well, what are the solutions? My suggestion is that a large part of the problem is the culture of Scottish schools. It's the culture of conformity that stifles innovation, but in fact promotes orthodoxy. And often that orthodoxy masquerades as a kind of recycled system that claims that it is new. But the culture of conformity is quite oppressive in Scottish education. And if you think it's nothing to do with you, then just consider for a minute the state of Scottish schools. These two images, I think, sum up the state of Scottish schools. I've been a head teacher for 20 years. I can get away with that picture. Part of the difficulty I think we have is that we have a system that's far too uniform for the 21st century. Of the 365 secondary schools in Scotland, 364, all but one, which is an exception for historical reasons, are governed in exactly the same way. In fact, they're governed by the way they were governed in 1918 by local authorities when the current system was set up. In 1918, there were in fact 36 local authorities. We've got that down to 32 at the moment. But part of the difficulty is that system, when it comes to introduce change, does it in a lockstep fashion. We don't have individual schools piloting things. Everyone has to do it at the same time. And that, I think, is understandable if you're looking for standardization and equality. But what it does is it robs the system of learning experiences, because the system is so uniform that sharing good practice is pretty much tantamount to rearranging the deck chairs in the Titanic in the hope that you'll miss the iceberg of social injustice. When it comes to school leadership, it seems to me that school leaderships are obsessed with the norms. What's happened recently in Curriculum for Excellence, for example, is head teachers have been worried sick, some terrified, that their school will be seen as different from the norm. Because if you step outside the norm, you run the risk of being pilloried in your next HMI inspection. So that culture of conformity, I think, has not served the least advantaged. But it's worse than that, because we accept statements like, the core business of schools is learning and teaching. Right, of course, learning and teaching, one would hope, goes on in schools. But the core business of schools being learning and teaching has led to a culture where teachers think a lot of the things that impact on a child's education are not their business. So, if we take Alexander Scott, who was a Scottish poet in the 1960s, we can trace this back as far as Alexander Scott, who summed up Scottish education in a two-line poem which I'd like to present to you in its entirety. Alexander Scott said, that's Scottish education. He titled that poem, Scottish Education. The point about it is that it's teacher-centric. And if you think that kind of thing has changed, I'd ask you to consider this. A first-year pupil, Heather, in a Scottish secondary school, is given a task in English to write from personal experience, write about the street where you live. Heather's answer is, my street is full of empty cans, dirty needles, and sweetie wrappers. Now, the pedagogical approach to that, the idea that it's about learning and teaching, says the problem here is Heather's spelling. The fact that she may live in an environment frequented by alcoholics and drug addicts is not the teacher's business. because the expertise is about learning and teaching, and therefore, that's the way it should be approached. Tom Leonard, a Glasgow writer writing in the 1970s, made a similar type of comment on the Scottish curriculum. He said, and I quote, "By the time I was 8, I could tell the difference between an elephant and a giraffe, between a lion and a tiger, between a rhinoceros and a zebra." And then he ended his essay, published in Scottish International, with this phrase: "But as regards the animal life of Glasgow itself, well, a cat was a cat, a dog was a dog, a bird was a bird, and anything smaller was for stamping on." Now, the editor of Scottish International, you will note, chose not to correct Tom Leonard's spelling. But if you think that has all changed and that the modern curriculum is different, consider this task. Back to Heather again, who in history is asked to write what she has learned about William the Conqueror. Now, Heather's a smart girl with a wide vocabulary, and she decides to use it. And correctly referring to William the Conqueror's illegitimacy, she writes, "William the Conqueror was a bastard." But to let the teacher know that she's not being precocious and that she's using the word accurately, she puts in brackets. Now, the pedagogical approach to that says, what is appropriate for a first-year girl in a Scottish secondary school to use as far as vocabulary is concerned in a formal school task? Is her choice of vocabulary, however accurate, appropriate? That's to miss the point. The point, of course, is how appropriate is it for someone like Heather, who might live in the streets frequented by drug addicts, to be learning anything about William the Conqueror at all, never mind being tested on it? So we've got a situation, it seems to me, where if we were to look at where we currently are, things have moved on. We now know that there are 10 socioeconomic deciles, and every school in Scotland now knows precisely which socioeconomic decile every pupil is in. The difficulty, of course, is that most schools have no clue as to what to do with that information, other than to use it to analyse examination performance. And guess what? If you're in deciles 1, 2, and 3, the lowest 30%, your chances of doing well in national examinations are massively reduced. So I've depicted these 10 deciles using Tom Leonard's 10 animals. I'm going to invite you to select an animal which best represents you. Now, once you've done that, here's your test. Now, that's pretty much the rationale for standardised national testing. There's something deeply inequitous about the Scottish system when we haven't solved even that problem. It seems to me one of the solutions would be this: to change the core business, to shift the emphasis away from learning and teaching in schools and onto pastoral care. If you focus on pastoral care, you're much more responsive to the nature of your intake, and individual schools ought to have the autonomy to diverse their responses in relation to their immediate the needs of their own pupils. The difficulty with that, of course, it seems to fly in the face of common sense. But let's, in fact, be blunt about it. Scottish schools are dominated by a culture that's so similar that if we don't do something to widen it, it will cease to become a learning system. Synectic is the word that William Goodman coins. I know it's a bit of an ugly word, but it's the best I could come up with it to describe what I think the culture change needs to be. And we need to have a culture in Scottish education that accepts diversity and, in fact, perhaps promotes it. And out of that, we will then develop what hopefully would be a learning system. There's very little point, it seems to me, in sharing good practice across the Scottish secondary education system when most of the practice is so similar. Scottish education has ceased to become, in many respects, a learning system, somewhat ironically, because teachers basically share similar approaches. The culture, however, will only change if school governance change. And I think if we could introduce a far higher level of school autonomy, we would get a wider range of schools that would be more responsive, more innovative, and that could be within a national framework. The difficulty, it seems to me, is that Scottish education has focused on strategies. And the quotation there is from Peter Drucker, the management guru, who said, "Culture eats strategy." And that, I have to say, is pretty much my experience in Scottish education. In fact, I'm almost at the point where I would say I'm against school improvement. I'm only against school improvement because it gets in the way of transformation. The least advantaged in our schools don't need school improvement. They need transformation. And the only way we're going to get that will be if we tackle the culture. In fact, culture in Scottish schools is barely spoken about, never mind adopted as a possible route for solution. We appoint improvement officers, we appoint attainment advisors. But if you look at Scottish schools, the pastoral care system that exists in secondary schools is perfectly capable of being expanded. And yet, in career terms, if you're a principal teacher of pastoral care in a Scottish school, on average, you learn 30% less than a principal teacher of subject, or curricular PTs. And there are far more of them. And in fact, in the current situation, principal teachers of pastoral care are being cut. So it does seem to me cultural change is the only way forward. And I would say, finally, just to end, I might want to quote or paraphrase Alexander Scott. I'll tell you.